back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. In today's episode, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Harris Cooper. Harris received his Ph.D. in social psychology from the University of Connecticut in 1975. From 1977 to 2003, he was on the faculty at the University of Missouri. In 2003, he moved to Duke University, where he is now Hugo L. Blomquist's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. Dr. Cooper has been a visiting scholar at Stanford University, University of Oregon, and the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City. In 2021, Harris published the book American History Through a Whiskey Glass: How Distilled Spirits, Domestic Cuisine, and Popular Music Helped Shape a Nation. In our pursuit to delve further into the world of alcoholic beverages beyond our love of beer, we're excited to speak to Harris and learn more about his expertise and his work devoted to whiskey. So Harris, without further ado, welcome to the Beer Bound podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and thank you for inviting me.
Harris, we spoke a little bit about you, but of course, I'm sure we missed out a lot. So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your academic pathway, maybe both in psychology and in neuroscience?
Well, I'm a social psychologist by training, not a neuroscientist, nor do I play one on television, as they often say. I spent many years at the University of Missouri. I've been at Duke for 20 years. I retired about 3 years ago from Duke, but I'm still active in the profession. I spent a lot of time being an editor of journals. And after retiring, I took on the position of the editor-in-chief of the American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. And that's a good half-time job. The rest of my time is spent finding unusual things to learn about and maybe write about them as well.
That's very intriguing to me. What's an unusual thing to you, Harris?
Whiskey, talking to guys who are beer drinkers and are whiskey curious. So I have an opportunity to maybe get some folks who listen and watch to maybe pick up a whiskey sometime, maybe pick up the book and become an expert themselves.
Harris, what interests you initially in psychology? Maybe go back to your initial days as an academic.
I have to say, my couch isn't behind me, so I really can't lie down and tell you all about how I ended up in psychology. But I suppose, like most psychology majors, when they enter a college, want to learn about themselves. You know, why am I so messed up? You get lots of students in psychology who are there, they're interested in psychology, but they'll read an abnormal psychology book and immediately think they have every disorder that they read about. I wasn't quite that way. I wasn't all that curious about psychological disorders. And so I found social psychology, which studies, generally speaking, about how everyday people interact with one another, how they form attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, social groups, how they pick friends, etc. And I found that to be really intriguing. I ended up with a double major in psychology and sociology. So I learned about the social world, both from the individual's psychology as well as from the groups. And that was great. Went to graduate school. And you pretty much told what happened after graduate school. UConn graduate, not too far from Toronto. I have been a psychology professor my whole life, during my whole adult life. During that time, I also developed interest in lots of other things. And when I retired, semi-retired, the notion of writing for more popular audiences, nonfiction, was something I wanted to do. It was, maybe I'll say it was on my bucket list.
So Harris, social psychology, you talked a little bit about that. Could you go into maybe some different courses or texts that explain this field like a little bit more? Could you talk about the courses perhaps that you taught or some research studies that you did that kind of explain this subgenre a little bit in greater detail?
Sure. Again, the best introductions to social psychology, and I know this is going to maybe turn people off, is to look at a introductory social psychology textbook. And what you'll find in there is chapters on attitudes, on aggression, on the self and identity, on the influence of groups on people's behavior and attitudes. I probably left out some things that some of my personality, also the interaction of a person, what you bring to an interaction, all of your past and your genetic makeup, your predispositions are the personality part of it. And then that can be a mediator of the way you behave with other people. It can also be the case that the way other people behave toward you will influence, when you go away, how you think about the world and yourself and your attitude toward yourself, your self-identity. So social identity is a big part of it as well. My personal interests were actually in the social psychology of education. So I looked at classroom processes and the social psychology of them. My dissertation, master's thesis, was on something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is how a teacher's understanding of a student might influence that teacher's, the way he or she approached that student, the kinds of questions he asked. We could even get into not only the difficulty of the questions, how long a teacher would wait. All those things would be based on the teacher's understanding of that individual. There's also the issue of discipline, how a teacher maintains order in a classroom. I was interested in those things. But there's another aspect, I suppose, I should mention, is my own interests over time gradually moved toward research methodology, how social scientists go about studying the social world, all of the different techniques that they use to answer questions, and how they use statistics to come to answers to questions, things like that. And most of the classes that I taught through my 45 years were courses in research methods. So all of the undergraduates who were psychology majors would have to take a course in statistics and a course in methods, and I specialized in teaching that kind of thing.
See, Harris, it's interesting because a lot of what you're saying, it seems very sociological to me.
Mm-hmm.
See, can you they seem maybe to be so very well connected to the types of research projects, and your dissertation seems like it could be a specialization in sociology. Can you pinpoint kind of exactly what makes social psychology different from sociology?
No, I can't. And the reason is because social psychology actually exists in both disciplines. Okay, they have, if there is any distinction in psychology, there would tend to be more of an emphasis on the person. Okay, social psychology and sociology has more of an emphasis on groups. Okay, but but the reason why I ended up having a double major was because I wanted to understand both traditions. They really have grown apart, but a social psychologist will tell you that you can find social psychologists all over the university and in all sorts of different disciplines. So our social psychology program at Duke has members who are also in the business school. We have social psychologists whose primary collaborators are in economics. We have a social psychologist in law. All of these different settings have need for social psychologists. So you think about people choosing jurists, jury members, and some of those companies that do that kind of thing will employ social psychologists. Marketing, social psychologists will find their way into marketing, not necessarily at the university either. Social psychologists are all over the place. All those other minor disciplines simply envy us. That's what best thing I can say.
There's a place for a social psychologist everywhere, is I guess what you're getting at.
Absolutely. And bars are a place that are a wonderful place to study human behavior and human interaction.
I
can agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we all could. Well, I really do, Harris. I want to get into your interest in a separate topic in a second, but you said something that interests me. You said a lot of your focus was on psychology in the classroom. So sort of maybe that being a social space.
Correct.
Do you see, since the inception of your career in this profound academic field, have you seen any developments within, maybe just in a lens of the United States, any changes within standard American education that has really developed and led to maybe different changes within society? Because I think a lot of our beginning and our upbringing and the way that we're socialized as human beings occurs in the classroom or at least at school. So maybe could you talk about that sense of maybe how that's shaped in the last 30 or 40 years, or maybe how that kind of leads to the socialization of us as people?
I would suggest that that's not necessarily a happy topic. We've seen the education has changed dramatically since I was a student in elementary school, and I'm sure since you have been too. Parental trust in educators has diminished. The regard for teachers, status of teachers has diminished. The perceived value of public education, having children from diverse backgrounds and with diverse learning needs, has diminished. And it's not a happy thing. It can drive teachers to drink.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's drown our sorrows in the next topic then.
Please.
Okay. So Harris, how does a well-established social psychologist get into writing a book that was published only 2 years ago that pertains more in a historic lens towards your country of the United States and its relationship to whiskey? How did that come to be?
Largely fortuitous. Okay, we spend our summers in Colorado, which is where I am right now, and we were spending a full summer. It was the first time we had been retired, and we thought about going to the Colorado wine country, which is on the other side. We're on the east side. It's on the other side of the Rockies. And we walked into my wife and I walked into a big liquor store in Boulder, Colorado. And we decided, well, there must be somebody here who could tell us where to go and nicely tell us where to go. And we asked somebody, and they said, wait a minute, let me get you the manager. And the manager looked up and said, we're going to Palisades. Where should we stop to visit wineries? And the guy paused and he said, I think you should go to California, which was his way of saying that maybe the Colorado wine industry had not quite matured to the point that California was. And he said, if you really want to, if you really are interested on your way, stop at some whiskey distilleries. The state of Colorado has some very favorable laws regarding whiskey and distilling, the way it's sold, how can it be sold? Can the distillery have a tasting room? Every state differs in terms of its whiskey regulations, its spirits regulations. So he said, okay, and he said, go to a particular distillery. And we went and we really enjoyed ourselves. And then we were up at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park. You may know the Stanley Hotel. Do either of you know what the Stanley Hotel is famous for? Canadians? No? I bet you will.
Not.
Tell you. No?
Maybe.
Maybe. Did you know the movie The Shining?
Yeah,
Oh, I do.
okay.
Yes.
Yes. The Stephen King movie.
Mm.
It's set in the Stanley Hotel. He changed the name in the book and the movie to the Overlook Hotel, but he got inspired to write The Shining when he was snowed in at the Stanley.
Interesting.
So we walked into the bar at the Stanley Hotel, and there were 1,200 labels of different whiskeys. And we started talking to the guy who was behind the bar, and he ended up being the manager. And he showed us the Colorado shelf. He pulled off the same whiskey that the guy at the liquor store suggested to us. And the liquor store, that bar became my classroom. And then my wife and I have always enjoyed dinners, going out for dinners, wine tastings. And then we discovered that there were whiskey tastings as well. So we started to go to some. And we discovered that some of them were fantastic. We had one guy who was doing Scotch whiskey, who showed up in a kilt and told off-colored jokes, taught us all the Scottish drinking songs and toast. It was just wonderful. We went to another one where the guy who was running it had index cards. He's sweating. He knows nothing about what he's doing. Okay. And I turned to Beth, my wife, and I said, we could do a better job than this. And she said, well, let's do it. And so I thought about it, and I have always had a very strong interest in American history, especially popular history. And I said, okay, well, maybe what I can do is I can put together a whiskey dinner where there are X number of courses, and each course is representative of a different period in American history. And then I can try and discover what the popular whiskey was at the time, whether or not it's still available, whether or not somebody claims they're still making the same whiskey 200 years later. And then we said, well, maybe we're going to do this as dinners, let's go and find the old recipe books, the cookbooks, historic cookbooks. And we started investigating what was popular foods at the different eras of American history. And then obviously the missing part was music. We said, we could play music in the background. And we had a little bit of a leg up on the other people who were doing this kind of thing, because most people who do wine tastings and beer tastings, I assume, and other kinds of liquors tend to be representatives of distilleries. And they tell people, you guys may know this from your other work.
Mhm.
They tend to be, they travel around, they might get in touch with you and say, hey, I represent Macallan's Scotch. Hey, you know, the beers, whatever, you know, beers, there are every brewery turns out X number style beers, right? And they would go around and they would do that, but they were always restricted to using the beers or the wines or the whiskeys that came from their particular brewery or distillery. We didn't have that restraint. So we could find whiskeys from different distilleries. So we decided that we would try this. We tried it out on some friends. They had a wonderful time. At least two of them said, have you copyrighted this idea? And I copyrighted the idea. This once the second person said it, who was a lawyer, I said, okay, I really have to copyright this. We started out with 8 periods of American history, and then we actually ended up with 2 dinners, each period with 2 distinct dinners. So it came to be 16 courses in a whiskey tasting dinner. We ended up doing it in a cooking school in New Jersey. We did it in a country club in Lincoln, Nebraska. We did it in a French restaurant here in Estes Park. And we started getting lots of requests as people. It was all word of mouth. And then COVID hit. And we had to cancel 2 dinners that we had arranged. And I'm sitting there and saying, well, you know what? Maybe I should just write it as a book, because I had all my notes. We had all the tasting notes. We had all the music. I said, let me just put it together as a book and give it away. And that's what we did. And the rest is history, as they say.
That's great. That's an awesome progression. I'm very curious. So are you also the cooks behind all the meals? Like you prepare all the food?
No, I am not a cook. What we would do when we did it with friends is we would apportion out each one of the dishes. So if we had, if there were 8 couples, each couple would say, you got to bring, we would say, you got to bring this. Make it. And we said, you can make a variation on it, but keep the main ingredients to what they were. So it's indicative of the time. Okay. And you can tell us what you did and how you chose to do it. Then when we went to the cooking school and the country club, there were chefs there. And the place here, I mean, the guy here has got so many initials after his name for his training is remarkable. And the chefs thought it was a great challenge. So we'd say, can your chef do it? They'd ask the chef said, absolutely. We'd sit with them, we'd talk about, you know, how it could work. And then the chef would come out and say, you're now tasting spaghetti, right? 1950s. It's Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner. Okay, what did Frank eat? Frank ate spaghetti. So here's that. And people would have a wonderful time. And if anybody is curious about it, who's listening, you buy the book. It is a manual on how to do this with your friends. You can do it in lots of different ways. You can do progressions through people's houses. So you do, 4 dishes in each person. There's desserts, appetizers, etc. The only two things I've ever prepared were the cookies for dessert. It's a whiskey-infused chocolate chip cookie, and I made my own variation on it. And in fact, right before I was speaking with you, Beth and I were preparing a couple of batches of them for our friends here. The other thing that I've done is Martha Washington's pea soup, and I serve it as a gazpacho. So it's cold. Instead of being a hot soup dish, we serve it first thing, sometimes before people even sat down to eat. We'll serve it cold, and it's Martha Washington's recipe. So those are the two that I've done. We have prepared them, but we haven't done it for a dinner.
That's good. That's super interesting. I'm kind of curious, and how you prefaced all that and said you more had a focus on popular history, or I guess a popular American history. What are some key points there? Maybe you can elaborate a bit.
Well, this is not the book begins with the notion that history is written by the victors, right? Whoever writes the history books. But then there are people who have tried to recapture not about the elites, not about the countries, but how the everyday people at that particular time were living, what they ate, what they listened to, what they went to the movies to see, and what they drank. And that was the part of it that interested me most. So really, the subtitle, how distilled spirits, domestic cuisine, and how distilled spirits, domestic cuisine, and popular music helped shape a nation. And it's really about what people were doing in their homes, the everyday folks.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Harris, a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago or so, we actually, you're our second guest pertaining to whiskey, because Garrett and I, we know a little bit about, quite a bit of, I do dare say, about beer, but we're both avid fans and have very little expertise on whiskey, but we do enjoy occasionally socially engaging in the imbibing of whiskey, and we love all the complexities that exist in this particular hard alcoholic beverage. We spoke with an author, Kevin Kosar. He wrote a text entitled Whiskey, A Global History. So we know a little bit of context in terms of what whiskey is, some of its old European history, but maybe can you touch on the United States? Where does the love affair begin with the United States and whiskey?
Well, it came over on the Mayflower. In fact, the folks on the Mayflower came over with a lot more alcoholic beverages than they did water. And the reason is water goes bad. Whiskey can stay forever. I don't know if there was beer, but I think there was wine that was brought over. But whiskey shows up on the Mayflower. People immediately begin, and a lot of folks who came over early would have been distillers. And they set up distilleries. The first distillery in the United States, at least for New Yorkers, is claimed, I think most people would agree with this, was built on Staten Island. It obviously started on the East Coast, started up in the New England area, moved down through New York into Pennsylvania and Maryland, which became very popular rye whiskey. It was made with rye. People are now called Monongahela, and people are now trying to revive that as closely as possible. One of the things that you learn in the book, and that not many people know, is that George Washington was a distiller. He had hired a Scotsman to help him out at Mount Vernon. he had a little river running through the area, and the guy eventually talked him into building a distillery on the riverbank. He made a lot of money off it. He also was a meticulous record keeper, and so at Mount Vernon, if anyone is ever there, you can visit an exact replica of George Washington's distillery, and they make whiskey at the distillery using the exact proportions of ingredients that were made in George Washington's time. So think about coming down the East Coast. Think about Paul Revere was a distiller and a copper maker, and you use copper in making a still. Mm-hmm. So he had made the stills. Now you might have Revereware on your shelf, and its claim to fame is that it has a copper bottom. So you can start with the Pilgrims and come down through the Revolutionary War, straight down the East Coast. And then it starts to move west. Right, it moves out to the Ohio River, and from the Ohio River down into Kentucky.
Okay, Harris. So we know, like in the world of beer, there's a lot of different styles, and then there's sub-styles that are connected to those. So, and a lot of those styles originate in different locations, mostly in Europe. So you have countries in Europe that specialize more in their recipes of ales, and then you have other countries that specialize more in what we now today call lagers, and then there are sub-styles to those. So whiskey, I think it's fair to say, is a European creation, but now it's a global phenomenon because you have, of course, Scotch whiskey, you have Irish whiskey, you have Japanese whiskey. We were talking before we got started about how whiskey's getting big in countries like India. Of course, Canada has its Australia, Canada, of course, the United
Canadian
States
Club
as well. Yeah. So, okay. So what makes American whiskey different or perhaps unique? And are there sub-styles that exist within the United States for whiskey in both the historic sense and then contemporary as well?
There are bunches of different whiskeys with different ingredients. So like all alcoholic beverages, beer is the same. The big issue is your mash bill. First thing is, what are you going to put in it? Okay, so whiskey involves grains, as does beer. Okay, in American whiskey, what has always been the leader of the pack, though it's changing, we'll talk about this later also, has been corn. Okay, corn and rye and wheat. Those are the three. And when you go to buy a bottle of whiskey, you can see on the label, hopefully, what's in it. It might not tell you exactly the percentages, but people try and get their unique taste through different kinds of combinations, amounts of corn, amounts of rye, amounts of wheat, right? So hops are put into beer to give it a particular taste, right? And it's the same with people trying to put together a mash bill, which is essentially the ingredients that they like, or they think other people will like. Okay, it's also the case that now in recent years that the kinds of grains that are being used in whiskeys are expanding. So you can now find rice whiskey, barley. There's now a single malt whiskey that's catching on. Lots of distilleries are trying to develop single malts, and they so the definition, it really is it's a grain. Okay, it's grain alcohol, and that's what makes it whiskey. Now you're probably curious about what's bourbon. Okay, somehow I knew we were going to ask that question. So actually the United States has made the same way. If you're drinking champagne, you know it's from France. You're drinking bourbon, you know it's from the United States by an act of Congress. Now that some people try and get around it and call it bourbon, they can, but they will get sued in the international court. Okay, so bourbon, the main thing about bourbon is that it has to be 51% corn. Okay, the mash bill has to be 51% corn, and it has to be aged in new oak barrels. Now, what does aged mean? Sometimes that means overnight. People will try and get away with that. Sometimes it means 23 years, right? And there's all sorts of issues with the interaction of the alcohol and the new oak, you know, the way they interact with one another, how vanilla can come in that way, caramel can come in that way. So there's that interaction. And then there are also specifications about what the proof level can be upon coming out of the still and then going into the bottle. Has to be at least 40% alcohol. Okay. Yes, I think that's right. But there's literally a list of these things. I think I've gone through about 4 or 5 of them. There's probably 3 more that I've missed. But bourbon is an American product. Lots of people, by the way, think that bourbon can only come from Kentucky, and that's not true. Bourbon is not native to Kentucky. You can buy bourbon from California. You can buy bourbon. Texas has a growing industry. Colorado has a growing industry. Just about everywhere has a distillery down the street that is creating a bourbon whiskey.
So the rule is that it has to be distilled and created and fermented and aged in the United States. That could be anywhere. Correct. That could be Alaska or Puerto Rico or Guam.
Yeah, but it has to be in the United States or its territories. And it has to be 51% corn.
So why then, Harris, you said there is an inaccurate stereotype that bourbon, like champagne in France, needs to be champagne. Some people think that bourbon needs to come from the state of Kentucky. You say that that's not true in a legal sense. Why do we bestow so much association and connotation with, maybe I'll say 2 states, both Kentucky and Tennessee, with their whiskey production and perhaps consumption as well?
Well, part of it deals with where the city of Louisville is situated along the river. And what it meant was that whiskey could be shipped down to New Orleans, and they like their whiskey in New Orleans. Okay, and it really can start in Pittsburgh and come on down the river. So it was a really good landing spot. One of I'll come back to the part of the reason also, but one of the reasons for aging whiskey was that it would sit in the barrels during the winter when the river was too low to ship these very heavy containers down the river. So they'd sit in the barrels, and then people would start to say, hey, tastes different. This is really good. It's smoother. It's got notes of vanilla, caramel, chocolate. So the fact that it sat on the docks in Louisville was very important. But there's more to it than that. Kentucky is built on limestone, and the water that runs through the rivers in Kentucky runs over limestone. And this has a really nice effect on the taste and value of the water. Okay. And they discovered that this was actually a really nice water for making bourbon. They also discovered, by the way, that limestone, water from limestone, has a really positive effect on your bones. And you know, Kentucky is not only known for its bourbon, what else is it known for? Come on, you got to answer these questions. What else is Kentucky?
Horse racing.
There you go. Very good. Okay. It's where horses are bred. Why? Because the water that the horses drink there is filled with limestone, runs over the limestone, and it builds good bones for the horses. So both of those industries in Kentucky are really tied to the water. We've met folks in Kentucky, tour guides who've told us, I don't drink water from a bottle. The water that comes out of my tap in Lexington and Louisville is better for me than what I get out of that bottle.
Harris, is that scientifically proven in the 21st century?
Yes.
Or is that, yeah?
You mean the influence on the bones? I can't tell you exactly exactly what is added to water when it runs over limestone, but it's an absolute fact that it changes the taste of the water and it changes the value of the water for your bones.
Get some good old-fashioned Kentucky bourbon to make my next mint julep then.
Absolutely. You get yourself some Maker's Mark.
There you go.
That's what you need. Mm-hmm. Tennessee is a little different. Tennessee is just down the road. Okay. But a Tennessee whiskey it's called the Lincoln County process. And this is one of the things that Jack Daniels is known for. Jack Daniel is known for. And what they do that's different is after the whiskey comes out of the still, they run it through charcoal. So it gets filtered in the charcoal. So if you hear something referred to as Tennessee whiskey, it's telling you that it's using a slightly different process. Okay. But bourbon whiskey has a national, I suspect that they're both copyrighted, so they know you can't call, I don't think you can call Jack Daniels bourbon whiskey, nor do I think Jack Daniels would probably roll over in his grave if he thought somebody was going to call his concoction bourbon whiskey.
I didn't know that about the charcoal filtering. That's interesting.
Yes, he has a, and you know, probably the most important person besides Jack himself for the popularity of Jack Daniels whiskey was Frank Sinatra.
Oh.
And the Jack Daniels Distillery puts out a special limited edition Frank Sinatra whiskey. And there is a rumor that when Frank Sinatra was buried, he was buried with a bottle of Jack. And that is also true. I've never heard anybody suggest that it was a made-up story. He was the first unpaid celebrity endorser of whiskey brand.
That's interesting.
Harris, I think something that's definitely fascinating about beverages like beer or whiskey is exactly what you started to discuss, is that these entrepreneurs, these grand figures who still resonate over their particular beverage genre. So maybe in the beer world, you have a guy named Arthur Guinness whose legacy lives on through a particular style of beer that's really entrenched itself in a national symbol, being Ireland. And then you spoke of course, the man himself, Jack Daniel. Can you talk a little bit about him? Who was Jack Daniel, and why did his brand, you mentioned Frank Sinatra, why is it now synonymous with being perhaps the most popular commercial brand of whiskey, I would imagine, on the planet?
It's certainly one of them. I think at least 5 brands would claim to be the best selling. Jack was the runt of a litter of about 10 who ran away from home. And he ran to a guy by the name of Call. Last name was Call. It may have been Dan. I'm not exactly sure. Exactly. And he said, "Can I live with you?" And Dan was a grocer, a distiller, and a preacher. And eventually he went to work for him. He met a friend named George, okay, and who was the son of the slave who was working the still, okay, for Call. And Jack just took an interest in it, started to hang out there with his friend George, and eventually the parishioners of Call's parish started to question whether or not it was really wise for him to be making alcohol. And his wife agreed, and they decided to get rid of it. And the way they got rid of it was they sold it to Jack. He and Uncle Nearest, who now there is a brand. I can tell you a little bit about that in a second. I think we're running out of time, but Jack told his inner circle that he was going to go to St. Louis for the World's Fair, and he was going to bring his whiskey and enter it into the World's Fair competition. He got there, and the other distillers made fun of him. They thought it was a joke that he was there because he wasn't dressed fancily. He was a really, really short guy. He knew nothing about anything but how to make whiskey. And when they held the contest, he won. They tried to stop the newspapers from informing the readership that this guy from Tennessee had won the ribbon. He went back, and that's how Jack Daniel's whiskey got started. There is now a brand which is called Uncle Nearest. That's a huge award-winning, and he was really, people claim that he was really the first master distiller slave. A woman by the name of Fern Weaver has rebuilt the Nearest distillery, populated with his ancestors. She started a foundation in his name that will pay for a college education for any of his descendants. And it's a really very popular brand of whiskey. There's a nice exhibit now. Jack Daniel's the company does not in any way try to refute the role that Uncle Nearest played. And there's a big display now in the waiting area when you take tours about the role that he played in the development of Jack Daniels.
Cool. I'm just looking it up now. Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. That's very
Uncle
interesting.
Nearest?
Yeah.
Hmm? Does it confirm what I said, I hope?
I'm just getting through it, but I think that's the case. Yeah.
It's what
Also, like very award-winning as well.
it's won an enormous number of awards. It's an excellent whiskey.
Trying
Fascinating.
to find some.
Well, Harris, you're correct. Unfortunately, we are coming close to an end. Typically, the way I like to end podcast is to sort of end on a bit of a prediction for the future, and maybe to come back to this episode in the next few years to see how much validity we've been able to establish here. But whiskey has a profound and strong history in its interconnection with the United States. Can you maybe tell us your idea of where you see whiskey's role in American culture in the 21st century? You can kind of think of maybe both in a benevolent and malevolent sense of whiskey has had its profound benefits in perhaps growths of industry and society. But of course, we're all aware of all of the evils and the detriment that comes along with hard alcohol. So maybe as the world perhaps decides to get a little bit more health conscious, I don't know if that's where we're really headed, maybe not. Does the role of whiskey still play? Does it stagnate in its connection to American culture in the 21st century? Does it need to evolve and change? Where does whiskey go in the 2020s, I guess you could say?
Well, its role in culture is more difficult, but I can tell you about the industry. The industry has exploded. I can still walk into a bar and say, somebody will mention the book and say, wow, it's really amazing that at this time you decided to write this book. It's in fact the case that the boom in whiskey has been going on for at least a decade. Okay. And it's all over the place. I am sure that you guys could drive 20 minutes and find a distillery in Toronto, right? Okay. I can see both your heads nodding, so I'm feeling a little bit better now. They are the craft whiskey industry is booming. And even the big guys, the Jack Daniels is coming out with a new variety all the time. Heaven Hill, which owns a whole bunch, is coming out with new varieties, new labels all the time. It's an interesting industry because when people are making whiskey now and putting it in a barrel, they have to put it away for X number of years, depending on how they want to do it. Okay, so that they're betting on the future, that the boom will not go away. Okay, and honestly, from where I sit, I wouldn't dare say that it's over or it will ever be over. But I do want to. I know we're over time, so maybe you'll cut this out or something else out. But you talked about what was the word you used about particular kinds of alcohol and cautions about their use. The point is you have to be cautious about your use of any kind of alcohol. Okay, whiskey, if you know nothing about it, all you can think about when you see it is John Wayne or somebody else walking into a saloon, getting a shot of rot gut, downing it like this, putting it down, picking up the bottle himself, and going like that. If you're going to do that, I don't want to be your friend. Okay, But just for you beer drinkers out there, if you have any bartenders out there, you can look this up. You can look this up yourself. I've talked to bartenders who have a saying, and it's called "a drink is a drink is a drink." Okay, so the next time you sit down with a 12-ounce can of beer, and it's how much? 12%?
Oof, that's a strong one. Let's shoot for 5.5.
5.5%. Okay, so if I'm drinking a whiskey and I'm drinking an ounce, maybe a little bit more than that, of whiskey, and I'm sipping it at the same rate you're guzzling your beer, I apologize, but I want to make the point, okay? And I drink 1 ounce of whiskey at 40 proof, and you're drinking 12 ounces of beer at 5 proof, and we drink them in the same amount of time, who has consumed more alcohol? Just
You should probably know this. I'm gonna say the whiskey. Let's go with the whiskey.
No, the answer is sit down and figure it out. You can even find a chart in the book that looks at whiskey and wine and beer. And one comes in about an ounce and a third, one comes at 3 ounces, and one comes in 12 ounces. And you can actually see that if you truly enjoy your whiskey, the same way you enjoy your wine, okay? In other words, you're going to sip it slowly, you're going to throw in a piece of ice, etc. And if you have 2 glasses of whiskey in the same amount of time that someone else has 2 beers, you have consumed roughly the same amount of alcohol. So if you're John Wayne, I don't want in a movie, I don't want anything to do with you. Okay, you don't know how to enjoy your whiskey. If you're a beer drinker, bless your heart. Okay, but you know, I have friends, I even have relatives who say, "Oh, wow, you had 2 shots of whiskey," and they've consumed a half a bottle of wine. And I bite my tongue and I say, "Well, actually, you're probably more influenced by the alcohol than I am." So whiskey's got a bad rap, and it comes from all those cowboy movies that we watched as youngsters.
Right.
Well, hopefully the artisanal whiskey revolution brings about a better stereotype for the beverage overall.
I bet it will. And you guys will help.
Absolutely. We're all about quality over quantity.
Quality over quantity, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you drink what pleases you.
Exactly.
Don't let anybody tell you what to drink or how to drink it, because
couldn't agree more.
They're full of poop.
Whiskey's got a bad rap. All right. Well, Professor Emeritus in Social Psychology from Duke University, Harris Cooper, we appreciate your knowledge and expertise. Of course, author of the interesting and expansive book, American History Through a Whiskey Glass, How Distilled Spirits, Domestic Cuisine, and Popular Music Helped Shape a Nation. Harris, thank you so much for your time. I hope you'll be back again in the near future and we can talk a little bit more and learn more about this fun alcoholic beverage.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your open-mindedness.
You're very welcome.
Of course. Thanks, Harris.
Thank you.
Take care.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.